Happy to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So David has led a16z's growth fund investments in Roblox, Databricks, SpaceX, OpenAI, Stripe, Anduril, Coinbase, Figma, Waymo, and Navan. That's just to name a few. That's not even all of them. Like I'm exhausted and impressed just sitting here reading the card. But I want to jump right in and talk about going public, right? And that's what this panel's about. And so, like a decade ago, Silicon Valley's dream was to found a company, raise to about 100 million in revenue, go public, and then, the founder become a billionaire on public stock later. Now, the dream seems to be to become a double decacorn, a triple, a quadruple decacorn, right? I mean, Stripe is 100 billion valuation, SpaceX 400 billion valuation, no IPO in sight. So before we get into when you might want to go public, my first question is, why? Why should you even IPO?
Well, again, thank you for having me. So why IPO? Look, I feel like this whole kind of private versus public thing has gotten a little bit blown out of proportion. An IPO is just a financing event. Being a public company in a lot of ways resembles being a very late stage private company these days. There are obvious reasons why it makes sense for you to be a public company if you're a mature organization. Things like liquidity for your employees, currency for doing things like M&A, like buying a company, getting access to capital, especially relevant for AI companies today. And then it sort of puts you on a different footing, or at least historically puts you on a different footing from a marketing standpoint. So, I remember CrowdStrike is one of the companies that I partnered with as a private company. And, it's a cybersecurity company. Now people know about CrowdStrike for many reasons, if you're a racing fan. But when they were going public, it was not very well known. And the CEO was like, this is going to be the best marketing event of my life. And I'm like, okay, are you going to go public and then you're going to kind of have a party and it's going to be great. You're going to spend the week in New York. And he was like, nope. The day after the IPO, I'm going to go visit 100 companies in 100 days. And I'm going to maximize the effect that we are now in every newspaper. We're the top of every headline, and I'm going to hammer that. And they really did a great job with performance right after. So marketing event is another reason.
So it really makes your company far better known at an IPO than even a big round.
Yeah, it used to. I mean, I would argue that that's not really the case now. I mean, who doesn't know about SpaceX or OpenAI or Stripe or Databricks? So we can talk about the pros and the cons, and if I were a founder, how I would think about that. But I think even that sort of marketing benefit has probably diminished a little bit in the last 10 years.
All right, so you did an analysis recently that showed that staying private longer is very good for VCs. So my question is, does this concentration...
Was it that obvious? I didn't want the point to be it was really good for VCs.
Well, that's why I read it. That was one of my takeaways. Does this concentration of growth in the private markets create systematic risks? I mean, it's a lot of money being concentrated in the hands of select few as opposed to a public offering.
Yeah, maybe I could just share a couple of the stats of what's happened. So since 2000, the number of public companies in the US has declined by 50%. So, it's been cut in half. Now the private markets, the valuation of the private market technology companies valued over $1 billion, if you just put all those together, they're worth almost $5 trillion. So that comprises 22% of the entire S&P 500. So just to put it into context, the Mag 7 is like 36%. So it's over half of what the Mag 7 represents. So I think the bigger observation which I would make is the composition of the public markets have just massively changed. So if you look at technology companies in software, in fintech, and consumer internet, and look forward at the next 12 months of forward growth, what they're projecting, there are less than 5 of them projecting 30% or greater growth. So if you want access to very high growth, cutting edge technology companies, it used to be that you'd catch them once they crossed $100 million of revenue in the public markets. It's not the case anymore. The only place to get them is actually in the private markets. And that's a radical shift. And so, I was having a debate with somebody recently. They're like, oh, what is going to happen to the small caps versus big caps in the public markets? What's going to outperform? And so I looked at the composition of the Russell 2000. 'Cause it's like historically, the old adage was small cap outperforms. And it turns out the most interesting technology companies are not in the Russell 2000 because they're all in the private markets. So this is a massive shift.
But our long-term, all of us that have 401ks, and anyone that's sort of young, the classic advice is invest in a small cap and they grow. And so is that gone away from people?
I think what you're starting to see is the early signs of institutional retail and money management capital finding its way into institutional private investing. So private equity is the first place that's going after it. I think give it a little time, our industry will probably grow up and the VC and growth industry will probably have access to it too. I think the pitch for a public company, the hard thing is, if you're a super high-flying growth stage company that has capital being thrown at you in the private markets, it's not quite as compelling anymore to be a public company. The cost of compliance is very high. It costs millions of dollars a year. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. So the private markets are a very welcome place for many of the companies that would like to stay there.
Are there risks to the company to stay private through these multi-decacorn valuations?
Yeah, so I think the hardest thing for companies is employee recruiting and retention. So to me, if I'm a CEO of a late stage company and I've reached $100 million or more of revenue and I'm trying to decide what to do, especially in the world of AI, my competition now is Google, Meta, Apple, Amazon, et cetera, throwing tons and tons of money at the employees that I'm competing for. And I think this is obvious to folks, but the way compensation works at those big tech companies is every quarter, the employee gets a deposit of new stock that's net of cash in their account, and they have this stock, and it's like, oh my gosh, I got hundreds of thousands of dollars of Meta stock in my account now. I can either sell it or I can keep it. And over the last 10 or so years, it's been a really good trade to keep it. And so the stock has gone up a ton, and if you don't want to keep it, you've just had cash. And so it's almost like getting some very large quarterly bonus with a lot of upside in it if you're an employee of one of these big tech companies. So one of the reasons to go public is to be able to compete with that more effectively so that you can compensate your employees in the same way. You can give them that quarterly stock and they can choose what to do with it. I think increasingly in the private markets, if you're worth high single digits, billions of dollars, you should probably be doing regular tender offers for your employees and your management team in the private markets. That's a big change.
Okay, so I have some questions about the mechanics of this. So you're a fan of tender offers, which you have to do. Secondaries or tender offers, letting employees sell chunks of their stock. So, but what's the disadvantage? What's the disadvantage of staying private longer and offering your employees these cash outs?
I'll put it in finance terms. So I think the trade-off boils down to this. I think it boils down to a higher cost of capital in the private markets versus greater flexibility to do whatever you want to do in the private markets. And so what I mean by that is, we're large investors, have led tender offers in companies like Databricks and SpaceX and many of the others that you named. I would argue that those companies could probably fetch a higher valuation in the public markets than they've gotten in the private markets. And so that's the trade-off of cost of capital. The cost of capital in the private markets, it's a trade. You're probably getting a little bit lower price. The flip side of that is you can control the way your price changes over time in the private markets, whereas you can't in the public markets. And this is all pretty fresh for everyone, right? Everybody's stock prices in all technology companies went up a ton in 2020 and 2021, and then they went down a bunch in 22 and 23. And it's really hard to deal with that if you're the CEO of a public company. That volatility creates a bunch of problems. If you're the CEO of a great company and it just so happened that you issued stock to your employees that were new hires when the stock price was $100, and then in 2 quarters your stock price went to $50, those employees that you hired, that got stock at $100 feel kind of ripped off, like they feel like it's not fair to them. And so you don't have to experience that kind of volatility in the private markets if you're the CEO, but the valuations you get are often lower than what you would get in the public markets. Does that make sense?
It does. I also think, though, that the employees, well, I don't know. You tell me. Does it feel like the employees might miss out on some of the benefit of going public sooner at a lower, a lower stock price?
Yeah.
And that they get their quarterly and they can do what they want with their stock as opposed to being told when they're going to sell and for how much?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that would be, the trade-off if I were an employee. This is actually interesting. So I think we looked at this. The previous generation of startups, when companies used to go public earlier, something like 80% of the overall value creation of those companies happened when they were public companies. And then now the number is like less than 50%. So a lot of the value creation that the companies are getting is happening when they're private, not public. I would say the flip side of this is if you're the CEO of one of these companies, you feel like you have a lot more freedom and control if you're in the private market. So if you're, Databricks, you can do the acquisition of Tabular and not have to worry about whether the stock market will react a certain way. Or, in the case of Databricks, coming out of 2021, every public company in infrastructure and software was hearing from their public investors like the same three things. They were like, stop burning so much cash. Why is your stock comp so high? And don't do anything. Like, you need to cut your employee base. And I was like, okay, I think there's still some really good things going on, but that was just the onslaught. It was a barrage of what you heard. If you're in the private markets, you could take a much more balanced and long-term approach. There's companies like SpaceX. Like, SpaceX is taking huge swings of things that would maybe be harder to do in the public markets. It's well covered in the press, like the attempts to kind of make Starship work to get to Mars. And so I think the sort of long-term orientation that you as a CEO can take in the private markets is very, very appealing.
I'm curious your thought on this. Like a year ago, Rippling made some news. They're not your company, right? I don't think so.
They're a very good company. They've done a great job.
For blocking former employees who worked at their most bitterest rival deal from participating in its tender offer, right? So it was a very controlling kind of a move, and there were people debating both sides whether they should or shouldn't. They could. But I'm sort of wondering, so when should startups allow ex-employees to partake in a secondary tender offer? When does it make sense for them to exercise all of that private company control that they can?
Yeah, I'll answer it in a general way, which is there's a very logical reason why you, as the CEO or the management team, would not allow the ex-employees to sell and tender offers. It's because it's an incentive for people to stick around at the firm. So much like terms like vesting, it's an incentive to be able to, to say to existing employees, hey, you're still on the boat. You're rowing with us, like we're in the fight together. This is a benefit to you. You can take part in it. But if you're an employee or an ex-employee who chose to do something else 3 months ago, you don't have that benefit. And so I think it's mostly an incentive to kind of convince employees to stick around because it's a benefit that they'll get if they do, and it's one that they won't get if they don't.
So when is it frowned upon by VCs and investors for founders to cash out? So, like founders need to stay hungry, but also if you're building a company through multi-decacorns, and everyone's getting tender offers, makes sense that you're going to want to do something yourself. So I don't know. From your point of view as an investor in a lot of these big companies, what do you want to see founders do about that?
Yeah, I think it's very founder dependent. So I've had many founders that I've worked with who are like totally clinical about it. And they say, I'm going to be very programmatic and I'm going to sell, some very small percent, X% of my company every single financing round. And, if you add all those up, I start with 100%, and by the time there's some liquidity event, I'll still have 80% plus. And so if it works out, great. I won't even think about that 20%. And if it doesn't, I kind of hedged, and, I had enough money to have a house and send my kids to school and drive a car. Totally cool. That's fine. I've had other founders that I've worked with, one of whom, ran one of the biggest consumer internet companies, I still remember this. We were in a fundraising meeting with him. He was raising money at $3 billion. This was in like 2016 or something like that. And he was raising money at $3 billion, and it was like one of the fastest ascents of a company's valuation at the time. This happens all the time now, where it's like, it went from 300 to 3 billion, but it was pretty rare at the time. It was in like the course of less than 6 months. It went from like 300 to 3 billion. And, we were talking to him about investing, and, we said to him, we're like, well, are you going to take a little secondary as part of the round? And he said, nope, I'm not. We're like, well, if I were your friend, I would say maybe take 5%. You'll never think about it. If things don't go well, you got a little bit. If things, do go well, you won't ever think about it again. That's fine. And he was like, secondaries for wusses. And I was like, okay, that's a hard and fast stance. And he did not take secondary. And it worked out really well for him, actually. But we do encounter people who kind of have that sort of like extreme conviction, and I respect that too. So I think it's sort of situation dependent. Most of the time we see them take a little bit, but it's always some rationale of like, hey, this is for a down payment on my house, or this is to make sure that I've got tuition for my kid's school, or something like that.
Is it a red flag if a founder's really cashing out an awful lot?
I wouldn't say so. There's certainly instances where it would be a red flag, but we don't encounter that much. I mean, most of the time when we're talking to founders, they're so high conviction, and they're just like, hey, I want to do what's prudent, and I don't want to have regrets. And so something like single-digit percentage or something as a percentage of their overall ownership is totally normal.
So what makes a company ready to IPO? All right, so there's a lot of arguments for staying private longer, and clearly the arguments are compelling because we are seeing it with company after company after company, right? So what makes a company ready to go public?
Okay, I've got like a very simple framework,
Right.
And I'll try to use examples. But okay, so I think if you're a money-losing company, so this would apply to most venture-backed companies. If you're a money-losing company, I think you need to be able to show a financial case to investors that has you growing north of 20% in year 6 of their model. And the reason I say that is because that's the sort of delineation for a public-minded person to build a model that kind of allows them to dream about what could go right. So their dream is to find the next Google or Visa or Apple or Tesla, something that will grow much different than what a normal degradation of growth would look like in a spreadsheet. So for example, when we were invested in Roblox in the private markets and we were talking about going public, they had a very credible story as to how they could grow for another 10 years. And it was mostly around people spending more time on their platform, older people engaging on their platform, and the cost of entertainment on Roblox was the lowest in the market relative to time spent. So people were spending a ton of time on it, and they did not need to pay very much to get that entertainment. And so, it's like cents or something per hour of entertainment compared to a movie or even, social platform or gaming platform. So that's point one, is this like, how do you dream on the revenue side? Point two is operating leverage. If you're burning money, you shouldn't grow your expenses at more than 85% of the amount you're growing revenue. So if you were growing revenue at 50%, you shouldn't be growing your expenses more than 42% or whatever it is. The third is a very precise ability to forecast your business. So you should probably be able to forecast your business plus or minus 10% accuracy 4 quarters out, which is pretty darn hard to do. And I think that last piece is one of the biggest reasons why companies stay private longer. Companies are like growing up much faster now in the sense that they encounter big scale and big company problems when they're much younger, especially our AI companies now. We have companies that are 100 or 200 people doing hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, and they're like having to make these critical decisions. And if you press them and had them forecast their business, they would be like, dude, I'm just trying to like hire more sales reps and engineers and like take in the orders that we're getting. So the forecasting piece is hard. If you beat and raise your first 4 quarters as a public company, on average, your stock price is up 26% at the 1-year mark. If you miss just one of those quarters, on average, your stock price is down 25%. So the stakes are very high for forecastability. And so I think that's probably, that plus, just the cost and complexity of being a public company are probably two of the reasons that the average size of a company going public has gotten much bigger lately. It's just hard to do those things if you're a small company.
But okay, so companies stay private longer, but shouldn't they implement the financial controls at about the same stage, right? So those are two different things, right? And I'm not necessarily saying hire a CFO, although that's always the sign, but
if you're hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, you should have a CFO.
But the actual same systemic, financial controls, at what point should startups be doing that for preparation for being public, even if they're not going to go public for a very long time?
Yeah, I think once you get to north of $100 million of revenue, you should start the process of hiring a professional, if you haven't already, a professional kind of finance, accounting,
all the way to 100
treasury.
million in revenue?
Yeah. Well,
really?
no, most of our companies are,
$10
million bucks of revenue have CFOs. But I'm saying that kind of team, if you're north of 100 million bucks of revenue, the CFO, the chief accounting officer, the treasury person, like those kinds of things, building that out. I think once you're north of 200 million of revenue, you should probably start doing some of the public company readiness just so you have it. So one of the things that we've done with a bunch of our companies like Samsara that went public is, more than a year before actually going public, start doing mock earnings calls. And so,
interesting.
Yeah, it's really cool. And make them do a quote unquote street case. So to test this sort of precision thing, forecastability thing. And so, they get in the habit of saying, hey, we beat our plan by this, we're gonna raise our plan by that, at least a year ahead of time. So by the time they're actually doing it, they feel ready. Like in those instances, they had all their private investors join those calls, ask questions just as if it was research analysts on an earnings call. So by the time they went, they were a well-oiled machine.
But still, 100 million seems high because 10 years ago, that's when people were going public.
Yeah,
but
it's
now
not the
you're
case
like,
now.
okay, not the case anymore.
Yeah,
okay,
not the case now.
So you wrote an essay called "AI Will Supercharge Model Busters," and I'm just going to condense and say model busters are breakout companies. He's got a broader definition of that, and it's interesting. But for this question, we'll just call them a breakout company. So you said there's a $1 trillion opportunity for agents doing white-collar jobs, right? Okay, so I have a white-collar job. So I replace myself by asking Claude to read your essay and come up with a question. And the question it came up with...
Claude could probably do a better job writing the essay than I could, too. So I'm very much at risk here, too. So...
question it wanted to know was, it pointed out that AI has a hallucination problem. And it asks, when do you think AI will be reliable enough for companies to really shift significant budget from humans to AI agents? So what did you think?
So my hot take is I think this is actually going to take a long time.
Yeah.
So I'm more on the side of Andrej Karpathy on this. So he just did this really good talk with Dorkesh on his podcast. And it got a lot of, sort of internet sensation because the summary of it was, he doesn't think that ASI, whatever that means to him, is going to happen within the next 10 years. So one of the things that really resonates with me is I've changed my mind about all these AI things like 10 times in the last 3 years, ever since ChatGPT happened. And we were investors in OpenAI before ChatGPT. So we saw some of this happening early. But one of the things that we thought at first was, oh my gosh, model companies are just going to do everything. Like all the software is going to go away. We're just going to live in the model, and the model's going to do it all. And over the last few years, I have come to the belief that there is tons of stuff that happens, especially in enterprises, that models are never going to be able to touch. So I'll give you the example. So there's all these studies about when radiologists are going to go away, right? So have you seen this? Because, okay, so...
We have a radiologist in Battlefield, so I've heard a little of this, but yes,
oh, okay,
when are
all right.
radiologists
I'll be super quick about this.
Yes.
So radiologists, this is like the ultimate task that an AI can do, is to read the screens. And so the number of radiologists has not gone down since this technology has been invented, it's actually gone up. And so why is that the case? It's the case because radiologists only spend 30% of their time reading the screens. There's a whole other 70% of the time doing other stuff. And the AI model companies are not training models to do that other stuff. But in order to replace the radiologist fully, you would have to do all that other stuff. So until a radiologist specialist software company comes along to replicate those things, the radiologist is not going to go away. And I think that same sort of example holds across many, many things in an enterprise on white-collar labor.
I have changed my mind a lot of times on whether or not AI will ever be able to replace humans. I mean, maybe me, I write for a living, maybe not. I'm pretty funny.
I think it's pretty far. I think it's pretty far off for you.
But I do want to. Today is David's birthday, and so he's doing this on his birthday. And so TC, we have a little gift bag.
Oh, thank you.
So he can dress himself from head to toe in TC, wear. So
Awesome.
Thank you for doing this today. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Yeah, great to be with you. Appreciate it.
Great.